Hey, it's Renee from the Craft Table. Welcome to week 4 of our Summer Embroidery Stitch Along. This week, we are learning how to do the chain stitch. In case you missed it, we discussed the supplies that we will be using during the stitch along. Week 2, we started stitching and learned how to stitch the back stitch. Last week, we discussed stitching the Lazy Daisy stitch, which is also known as the detached chain stitch. And so this week we learn how to do the chain stitch. If you have not watched the previous week's video on how to do the Lazy Daisy stitch, I highly recommend you watch that, as the chain stitch builds on to how we stitch the Lazy Daisy stitch. Also, I want to thank those of you who have left me comments either on the YouTube videos or sending me emails about how much you're enjoying the videos. I really appreciate that. It's hard for me to know when I'm not in person. I do tend to over-explain things. However, if you find that I'm not explaining something sufficiently, I want to know that as well, because my number one goal is for everyone to enjoy this 14-week stitch along and learn every single stitch that is presented. The advantage of having these videos virtual is that we don't have to worry about what someone's schedule is. There's no way, if you've ever been in a group or a committee, there's no way to ever pick a day and time that is convenient for everyone. So that is why I love having the format of online on demand. The drawback to that is I don't have live feedback of how my teaching style is being received. So again, I welcome constructive criticism and suggestions. So let me know, okay? So in the video tutorials, I demonstrate how to do the chain stitch several times, quite a few times. But I haven't stitched all of the places that I plan to stitch the chain stitch on these videos, because I am working at the same time. I'm stitching these, well, maybe just a week ahead, but I'm really not moving too much ahead of what the stitch along schedule is. And I want to leave room for possibly changing my mind on where I stitch certain things. I do show my sample panel, the very first panel that I stitched on, that's completed and I made into a pillow, so that you can look and see what I did at least the first time around. And I'm using that as a guide this time, although I am making some changes, and I know that going in. One reason being I am adding some stitches to the stitch along that I didn't incorporate into my first panel. I also wanted to stitch more this time around than I did before. So that should be helpful, even if I don't stitch every single thing this week on how I did the chain stitch. You can see what a particular finished project looks like and where I did stitch the chain stitch. Okay, let's get stitching. Let's look at where I stitched the chain stitch on my original fabric panel. So I did the chain stitch around that heart. I did it on the rainbows, on the stem of this particular leaf, around that flower. I did it inside that leaf, around the wings on this particular heart, around that flower, and on the outside of this flower, which I'm going to do something different this time for this flower, so I'm not going to be doing that. Again, around this flower, around the butterfly. The antenna is not the chain stitch, and neither is the stem. We'll be talking about that in a future lesson. That is the raised chain stitch, which is another really fun stitch. I did the chain stitch on the outside of this flower, again on the rainbow, and on the outside of this flower. But that will give you an idea of where I originally stitched the chain stitch. I'm going to demonstrate how to stitch the chain stitch first on this stem of this leaf. And just like we did with the lazy daisy stitch, there is more than one way to stitch it. So I will demonstrate one way, and then I will show you a different way of doing it as well. So when I stitched this chain stitch on my original panel, I used the same color as the outside of the leaf, which was Easy 34. This time I'm going to mix it up a little bit and do a darker thread for the stem. So I'm going with Easy 35 for those stitching along wanting, 35. For those wanting to stitch it exactly how I'm stitching it, or just want to know what colors I'm using. Okay, so I have threaded my needle, tied a knot, and I've brought my needle up from the back at where I want to start my stitching. When I stitch this chain stitch, I typically stitch it away from me. That's just what's more comfortable for me, kind of from bottom to top. So I'm going to be following along on this line. So I'm going to start here and finish up there. So if you haven't done the lazy daisy stitch, you might want to watch that video first. I think it just kind of helps understand what we're doing with the chain stitch, because we're going to start off like we're going to do a lazy daisy stitch, where I'm bringing the thread over to my left and holding it away out of the way with my thumb. And I'm taking my needle and I'm going down right where I came up, and I'm bringing my needle up where I want my stitch to end. So about a quarter inch, I just eyeball it. And I'm making sure that my thread is forming a loop behind my needle. So if it helps, you can just bring the needle or bring the thread right behind the needle. And then I'm pulling my needle through, and I'm pulling it in the direction of where my stitches are going to go. Like that. Now, if we were doing a lazy daisy stitch or a detached chain stitch, we would end this by taking our needle to the back over the loop. But we're going to continue on to the top. And that is why it is called a chain stitch, because the next stitch we're going to make is going to start inside the lazy daisy stitch that we just stitched. So if you can almost imagine, it's like we're making another lazy daisy stitch. I've got my thread where I came up. It just so happens it's on the inside. And I'm taking my needle down right where I came up. Excuse me. And then I'm bringing my needle up, making sure my thread is behind my needle. And pulling it through. Now, another example of how things can get messed up, especially when your thread is long. See how my thread is sort of twisted here? So I was able to just kind of untwist it. The key, like most of the stitches that we talk about, is trying to be consistent in the length and the amount of tension you're using when you pull your needle through. Can you see it's 2 stitches, and the second one starts inside. So that's why you'll see as we do more, but it's a chain of lazy daisy stitches basically. So we're just going to continue doing that till we reach the end of where we want our stitches to go. Sorry, my thread's getting caught on the screw of the hoop. Now, the stem is a fairly straight line, but you'll see when we do the rainbow that this stitch is also good on curves. It's just a matter of where you point your needle when you're making your stitch. I hope this makes sense. Again, since we've already done the lazy daisy stitch, I feel like this stitch should come pretty naturally. Some people get a little confused when I tell them you're going to put your needle back in the middle of your chain. But again, if you think of it like a lazy daisy stitch, if it helps to just sort of forget that you're inside of a chain, each stitch is an individual lazy daisy stitch. We just happen to be not doing that last step of closing up our stitch because we are continuing to nestle each of the stitches together. So again, my thread is off to the side, taking my needle down right where it came up. It just happens to be inside the loop. And then I am bringing my needle up where I want my stitch length to be, where I want it to end. And I'm pulling it through, making that loop. So let's do this one more time. I'm taking my needle down where my thread is, bringing it up where I want my stitch to end, or that particular part of the chain stitch, making sure my thread is looped behind the needle, and then pulling it through. As we did with the lazy daisy stitch, you can do this in 2 steps if it makes it easier. So again, my thread is out of the way. I'm taking my needle down where I came up, and instead of going ahead and bringing my needle up in one step, I'm going to take my needle to the back and pull it, but not all the way. We did this with the lazy daisy stitch. So if you need to refresh your memory, you can go back to that video. And then before I've pulled my thread all the way to the back, I'm going to bring my needle up where I want my stitch, this particular chain link stitch, to end. Making sure it's within the loop, that my thread is forming the loop behind my needle, and then pulling it through. And I don't know if you remember when I was saying that when I did my back stitch on this leaf, I intentionally left this part open because I knew I was going to come back in with a different color thread. And so I left that gap for my stitch. Now, I could easily have stitched over. If there was a stitch there, that would have been fine too. But again, because I knew I was going to be coming back with a different color thread and doing a different stitch, I wanted to leave that gap. And so here I am. See, it makes it much easier not having a stitch right there. But if I did have a stitch, I would actually, the way my stitching worked out is the needle went down before there would be a stitch, and it's coming out on the other side. So I wouldn't have that bulk. I wouldn't have the bulk with my needle, but there would be a little bit of a bulk where the stitch overlapped. The chain stitch overlapped the back stitch, which is fine. I've done that before. And also remember how I said when I was demonstrating the chain stitch that your stitch lies more smoothly. I don't know. If you're pulling in the direction that you want your stitch to go versus pulling it like that. And also, can you see how my thread gets a little twisted? The stitch makes it twist more than like doing a back stitch. So the solution to that is just turning your work over. It's kind of hard for me to demonstrate the way I have my camera set up, and just dropping your needle down kind of in the air and letting it untwist. I'm approaching what will be my last stitch. So I pull my thread through like I would, but I'm ending my chain of stitches. So this is where I end it like I would in a lazy daisy stitch. I'm going to take my needle to the back by putting the needle over that loop. Can you tell? And then securing that stitch by taking my needle to the back. See, there's that little like back stitch basically. So that is the chain stitch. And I kind of like having a different color green going through the inside of the leaf, making that stem. Now I'm going to do the chain stitch on my rainbow. And there are different ways that you could decide to stitch this. I don't know if you've noticed that the width of the rainbow stripes is quite wide. So when I was doing it, let me pull out what I did the first time. So I made the decision when I did it the first time that I would stitch on the outer part of each stripe. And I say each stripe, I didn't do all of them. I didn't do these smaller ones in the center. And the colors that I used the first time for this blue is Easy 36. And then for the orange, I used Easy 15. And then the pink, I think when I did this the first time, I didn't have the 5-weight pink. So I used an R-fill floss. But this time I'm going to use, because I'm doing all Sue Spargo 5-weight, I'm going to do Easy 20. And then for what I call the mint green, let me think. I think I used Easy 30. And the first time around when I went to this outer one, I didn't really have a thread color for that, or I wasn't sure. So I had a variegated 5-weight that I used, and that particular color does not come in an 8-weight. So this time around, I'm going to go with the Easy 34. It's not an exact match, which depending on the look that you're going for, it definitely doesn't have to be. But I think that's what I'm going to do. Because the other option is this yellow, and I'm not sure that I like I don't know. We'll see when I get to that. So that's what I decided to do. And I think that's what I'm going to do again, is do the outer part of the ring. You could even fill it in by doing several rows of a chain stitch if you wanted to have a thicker line. I'm going to start on this teal blue. And because I'm doing the outer part, I will start here and I'll make my way around and I will end right there. So with my needle threaded and knotted, I'm going to bring it up from the back where I want to start stitching and pull it up through the front. I've got my thread off to the side, taking my needle down right where I came up. Since this is where I started, there's a knot on the back of my thread. So I have to be careful that first stitch that I'm not putting my needle into the knot. And then I'm coming up. Now, I probably will make my stitches just a teeny tiny bit shorter just because of the area that we're doing. You want to be able to have that curve without having big, long stitches. Hopefully that's not too long. So I did my lazy daisy stitch, but instead of ending it, because I'm doing a chain of stitches and I want them to all nestle within each other, for my next stitch, I'm just going to take my needle back down where I came up. It's inside the loop. Again, sometimes that confuses people, but that is exactly how you want it to be. And then bringing your needle up where you want your stitch to continue. And again, we're going around a curve, so all you have to do is just, point your needle in the direction of where your stitch is going when you come up. So I've got the thread behind my needle. Let me zoom back out. And I'm pulling my needle and my thread through that loop, making sure it forms a loop. And I'm pulling these a little bit tighter. And I think I told you I like to stitch kind of vertically away from me from bottom to top. So you'll see me kind of move my hoop a little bit as I go around. I'm keeping my thread out of the way by holding it off to the side with my thumb. I'm taking my needle down where I came up. And you see, we're going around a curve. So I am kind of rotating my needle a little bit and bringing it up where the curve goes, following the curve. And that's probably a little too long. My thread is behind my needle, and I'm pulling it through. Now I'm demonstrate doing it in 2 steps. Thread off to the side, needle down where I came up. And this time, instead of bringing my needle immediately up where I want my stitch to go, I'm going to take it to the back, pull it until it has a loop on the front, but I'm not pulling it all the way back or pulling it all the way through. And then I'm bringing my needle up where I want my stitch to be. Can you see that? My needle is inside the loop. The thread is behind my needle. And I'm pulling it through. And again, I like to kind of pull it in the direction that I want my stitch to go. And for me, because it's easier, I am turning mine because I like to stitch this way. You got that twisted thread. That can be annoying with the chain stitch, but otherwise I love this stitch. And on these curves, it is sometimes easier to do a two-step stitch rather than all in one. But the steps are the same, going down where your thread came up, coming up where you want your stitch to end, making sure the thread is behind you or behind the needle so that it forms that chain, that loop. Doing that outer, the outer rings will be much easier than doing these inner rings because they're not, the curve is not quite so tight. So I'm finishing my stitch by taking my needle over that loop right at the base of the rainbow, like that. And what helps with your stitching on a design like this, I'm going to zoom in. As you can see, the pattern itself is not super straight. You know, it kind of has that little, that organic design, which I really love. And so you don't have to worry too much. And I'm trusting you guys not to judge me because I have it zoomed in super, super close. And you will see that this last stitch isn't quite the same length as the others. I'm okay with that. If that were to bother you, you could undo these last two stitches and then make this one a tad shorter. So this one would be a tad longer, and that would probably be a little bit more consistent, but I'm okay with this. So I'm going to leave it, and then I'm going to switch to the orange thread and do that same and continue on with the orange, the pink, the mint, and then this yellowy green on the outside. I finished stitching the rainbow, and I'm really pleasantly surprised at how that darker green ended up looking on the outer ring of the rainbow. I wasn't really sure at first, and when I was thinking of the colors to include in the kit for this project, I didn't want to overwhelm people from a budgetary point of view with having 15 or 20 different colors. So that's why I didn't really come up with a color just for that. But yeah, I think it gives it a depth of color that I like. If you're working from your own thread stash and you have something that's a little closer to a yellow-green, then that would work. I would encourage you to use that if you would like. But if you're using the kit, again, I think this color works nicely there. I demonstrated the chain stitch on a line that kind of went from this point to this point. And then we did the chain stitch on a curve where again, we start at one point and end at another point. And now I want to demonstrate how to do the chain stitch on this flower. That way I can show you a couple things. With a shape like this, we're going to end where we started. In other words, it's going to close in on itself. I also wanted to demonstrate how you negotiate corners or points, and also what to do when you're working on a chain and you run out of thread, how to stop and start and still maintain your chain, so to speak. For the flower, I'm going to be stitching with the Sue Spargo 5-weight pearl cotton in color Easy 16. I have my thread and my needle, and it is knotted. And I think I'm going to start right here. So I'm bringing my needle up from the back, right at that point. And so I'm going to stitch around the outside of this flower, just following along. Now, I don't know that I need to keep explaining stitch by stitch, but I will go over it one more time. I've pulled my needle to the front, my thread to the front. I've got my thread over to the side, holding it out of the way with my thumb, taking my needle down where I came up and bringing it up where I want my stitch to end. I've moved the thread so that it's behind my needle, and I am pulling my needle through. Now, let me zoom in again one more time. The shape of this flower, I call it organic. It's just sort of curves around, and in some places it has more of a curve than others. So it's up to you whether you follow it exactly. So like for instance here, you can barely tell that there's a little point right there. For something like this, I'm not even going to really I'm not going to worry too much that it's an actual point. I'm just going to kind of go along. The chain stitch is such that, it's not a back stitch where you're going to be able to see it as a line. There's some width to it. So I'll show you what I mean. Whereas when we get to here, I really want to make sure that my stitches indicate that it definitely goes in and then comes back out. But for now, I'm just going to try and follow it in such a way that it follows the curve, but not necessarily makes it into a point, if that makes sense. And that's what I like about working on a panel like this. It's very forgiving. So let's see. All right, so see how I've got my stitch and my needle right there. I'm coming up on the inside of that point. Now there's two ways you can do this. I'm going to show you one way, and then when we get to this point, I'll show you a different way. So the first way would be exactly how we would do it if we were running out of thread. What I would do is I would finish my stitch like I was done stitching. I'm going to the back. So regardless of whether I am turning a corner and I wanted to end my stitch like that, or I'm out of thread, the way I keep going with my chain is I bring my needle back inside, pretending like I hadn't finished it off. So I'm bringing it up where I would have if I hadn't finished off that stitch. See how the thread is coming up on the inside of that loop. So that's where I'm bringing my needle up. And then I just continue, and then I continue with my stitching. Now, because it's an angle, one of the reasons why I stopped that way is so that I can pivot. It makes it easier to start going in a different direction. And I don't have to do it that way. I can just continue stitching, and that's how I will demonstrate it when we get to here. But if this is the way I'm doing it, or if also I've got a new, I'm starting with a new needle and thread, again, I'd pull my needle up from the back and start right here. And so I'm going to take my needle down like I did before. And this time, because I'm at that point, I'm going to again, I've got a knot back there, so I have to be careful. So I'm just going to start stitching in this direction. And then I just continue on. So how I'm going to do this stitch as I reach that point is I take my needle down and I come up where I want it to end, pull my needle through, so this time I'm doing my stitch in the two-step. It just makes it a little bit easier because I'm going to be pivoting. So I'm putting my needle down where I would normally, where my thread came up. Let me zoom this back out. So I pulled it so that I just have that loop there, because I'm going to start going in this direction. I'm bringing my needle up where I want my next stitch to go. Again, it's inside the loop. The thread's behind my needle, and I'm pulling it. And now I'm going off in that direction. Can you see that? And then the rest, this part of the petal I'm back to my gentle curves. So I'm just following along. This time I really am running out of thread. So I'm going to do this last stitch. And I'm taking my thread to the back. So I've rethreaded my needle, got it knotted, and I'm going to restart my chain. And I realized there's actually a third way you could do this. I was about to say I'm going to come up inside where I finished, where I left off, and keep going. And that is usually what I do. What you could do, if it's easier, is you can just you can start a new chain. But if you're going to do that, I would suggest you do it super, super close to where you finished, to where you really can't tell that you're starting a new chain. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate here. So you can tell, if I zoom in, that I did not start inside the loop. I actually started right next to it. So if that's easier, you can do that. But if you do that and you want it to look like it's a continuous chain, again, you need to just be really careful where you start. And I rarely do it that way, but I thought I would show you that method just in case the other one's a little too complicated. So I think once we get going, you won't even really notice that that is what we did. The more you stitch, the less likely it is that one little spot is going to be focused upon. See if we zoom in now. I'm wondering if you can even really tell. I mean, you can tell if you look super, super close, but not enough to really make a difference. Again, if that's something you wanted to do. So I'm actually going to go in because I didn't leave a whole lot of room. So I'm going to go in a little bit further than the design goes in, just so that I can kind of make that point a little bit more noticeable. So here's another demonstration of, switching directions. So I'm going to go down where it came up. I'm going to use the two-step method to demonstrate. So now I'm going to come up where I want the stitch to be, inside the loop, and pulling it in the direction that I want the stitch to go. And now I've turned my hoop so that I'm stitching in that direction. And we're getting to where our stitches began. And I probably shouldn't have started on a corner or on a point. The technique is the same. It's just going to look a little different since we are going in at an angle. But you just want to finish your stitch. So you're going to go down inside like you always do. You want to come up right before the other stitch begins. So that you finish, you do your last stitch over the loop and inside that first stitch. I felt like when I was trying to demonstrate how to close up your chain when you're working on that flower that was a continuous shape, and also when you ran out of thread and had to restart your chain, I felt like I didn't really explain that adequately, or maybe it was a little bit confusing. So I'm going to demonstrate on this piece here. I started here. And then I ran out of thread. So I have rethreaded my needle and I need to keep going. So you can tell I finished my stitch. Hopefully you can tell. You can see where I finished off my stitch there. So now that I've got a new, a rethreaded needle, I'm going to come back up from the back and I'm going to come in right where the previous stitch ended, or would have ended if we hadn't run out of thread. And I'm just going to start over. Pretend like that stitch, like there's not a little, finishing stitch there. And I'm going to take my needle down right where I came up and come up where I want my next stitch to be. You really can't tell. Okay, so this will be my final stitch to close up that shape. So I am going to take my needle down like I always do, and then I'm going to bring it up. I'm bringing it up right where that previous stitch began. And then I finish it by taking my ending stitch over my loop and into the first stitch. This is my first panel, but I wanted to point out something. On this butterfly here, where I did the chain stitch, I plotted it out in such a way when I was stitching that I didn't have to pivot right here. So I stitched from here to here, and then I stitched from here to here, and did the same thing over here. So I stitched this way, and then I stitched this way. Over here, this top part is super tight. So again, I did this all in one. And then this part I did separate. And I think what I did here, because it's super tight, it looks like I went from here to here. And then when I started here, when I got to this part, I think I took it to the back and then started. Whereas it looks like here, I did it all in one. So it's just up to you, how you want to do it, what you feel most comfortable with if you decide to do the chain stitch in those areas. There's no one correct way to do these stitches. So I don't want you to get hung up on, I need to, take my thread and pivot my fabric. And, if it's easier to just stop and restart, that's perfectly okay. Or to decide, I am not going to do the back stitch. I am not going to do the chain stitch there. I think I'll do the back stitch. That's going to be so much easier. I can't wait to see where you apply the chain stitch on your fabric panel. Leave me a comment if you have any questions or just want to provide some feedback. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. Next week we will learn how to do French knots. And in the meantime, happy stitching.